Lieutenant sat alone at his table in the station cafeteria, eating his meal without looking at the other people around him. He had been stationed on the diplomatic vessel for 8 months now. The cafeteria was always crowded. There were humans and many other alien species who worked or visited the station. Everyone kept to their own groups most of the time. Nobody wanted trouble. Was different from many of the other military officers. He had studied alien behavior and cultures during his training. He believed that understanding came before fear. Most soldiers learned weapons and combat, had learned languages and psychology. This made him unusual among his own people. The food on his plate was bland but nutritious. It had to be food that all the species could eat, so nothing was very flavored. Did not mind. He ate slowly and watched the room without seeming to watch it. This was a habit from his military training. Always know what happens around you. Always see the dangers before they come. The cafeteria was organized in a specific way. The far left side had the temperature controls for the who needed cold air to survive. The middle section was neutral, where humans usually sat. The right side was warmer for the species called the delegation had their own section in a small room connected to the main cafeteria. They were kept separate because most species did not trust them yet. Were predators. They had sharp claws and teeth. Many humans had seen in military contexts, not peaceful ones, so they stayed away from them. Had finished half his meal when he noticed something wrong. The air got colder. A door at the back of the cafeteria had opened, but it was the wrong door. It was the door that led from the containment area into the main cafeteria. This door was supposed to stay locked during meal times. Someone had made a mistake. Then saw them. 3 small creatures came running through the open door. They were but young ones, cubs really. They were no more than 3 seasons old, maybe smaller than human children, but with longer limbs and sharp features. Their scales were bright colors, not the dark gray of adult. They looked around the cafeteria with wide eyes, seeing the open space and all the different beings eating. The cafeteria fell silent. Watched as everyone stopped eating. Forks were put down. Conversations stopped. Some people stood up from their chairs. The cubs did not understand what they had done wrong. They only knew that they were in a big new place with lots of interesting things to see. Knew what everyone was thinking. He could feel their fear. Cubs were dangerous. There had been incidents before. Human soldiers had been killed by young in previous encounters, but knew something that most people did not know. Those incidents had happened because humans had reacted with fear and violence first. They had responded with instinct, not malice. One of the cubs noticed the humans sitting nearby. Its head turned towards table. The other 2 cubs followed its gaze. Then all 3 of them started moving toward. They moved quickly on their 4 limbs, their claws clicking on the metal floor. Their heads were tilted, curious about this new type of being. Did not move. This was important. Moving would trigger defensive responses. Running would trigger their hunting instincts. Fear would be smelled and would create more fear, so sat perfectly still. He put his fork down slowly on his plate. He kept his breathing steady and even. The 3 cubs reached his table. They were small enough that they had to climb up to reach the surface where his food sat. They grabbed at the edge of the table and pulled themselves up, their claws scratching the metal. The sound was loud in the silent cafeteria. Everyone watched. Some people reached for emergency buttons beneath their seats. Security guards moved toward the cafeteria but did not rush in. They knew that sudden movement could cause a disaster. One guard looked at another. Neither of them knew what to do. Looked at the cubs. Their eyes were bright and interested. They were not angry. They were not hunting. They were just curious. They had never seen a human up close before. The handlers usually kept them far away from humans. This was their first real chance to explore. The largest cub reached towards plate and took a piece of fruit in its small clawed hand. It brought the fruit to its mouth to smell it first. Did not stop the cub. He waited. If the cub wanted to eat the food, that was fine. Then the cub took a small bite of the fruit. It made a sound almost like a laugh. The sound was high and quick. The other 2 cubs heard this sound and moved closer to table too. They wanted the food as well. Reached slowly toward the plate. He moved his hand very carefully, like he was moving through thick water. He took another piece of fruit, a small piece that would fit in a cub's mouth. He held it out toward the nearest cub. The cub looked at his hand. It looked at the fruit. Then it stepped forward and took the fruit directly from his fingers. The entire cafeteria was watching this happen. Nobody made a sound. Even the who usually did not care about issues had stopped to watch. They clicked their mandibles together, a sign of high attention. Other humans in the cafeteria had frozen completely. Gave fruit to the second cub, then to the third. All three young ate from his hand without showing any sign of aggression. They were playful and curious. Their tails, which had been rigid with excitement, began to move in a slower, relaxed way. One of the cubs, the smallest one, reached out and touched shoulder with its small clawed hand. The claw was sharp, but the cub did not press it into his skin. It was just touching, exploring, discovering what this new being felt like. Allowed this to happen. He knew that this moment was important. It was more important than fear. It was more important than protocol. It was more important than all the warnings they had been given about keeping distance from. A sound came from the far entrance of the cafeteria. The handlers were coming. They had realized that the cubs had escaped. They moved quickly toward the table where sat with the three young. When they saw what was happening, they stopped moving. The handlers looked at. They looked at the cubs, who were now calm and content. They looked at all the other people in the cafeteria who were watching this moment. The handlers did not know what to do. They had been trained to respond with force if cubs escaped into areas with other species. But what they saw here was not a threat. It was something else entirely. Looked at the nearest handler and did not look away. He held the cub's gaze steady and calm. The handlers, did not move forward. They did not call for guards or weapons. They simply stood at the edge of the cafeteria and watched. This was good. It meant they were thinking instead of reacting. It meant they understood that this moment was different from what the training manuals said it would be. Continued to feed the cubs small pieces of fruit. He kept his movements slow and gentle. He kept his eyes soft. Every part of his body language was telling the cubs and everyone watching that he was not a threat, that he was someone safe, someone who understood that young creatures deserved to be treated with care. A young human engineer named Dakota was sitting 2 tables away from. She had been watching him for a long time. Dakota had heard the stories about attacks. Everyone on the station had heard them, but she had also noticed that was different. He did not carry as much fear as the others. He studied instead of assuming. He thought before he acted. Dakota stood up from her seat. She was nervous, but she moved towards table. Several people tried to stop her. A security officer grabbed her arm, but Dakota shook her head. She was not scared. She was curious, just like the cubs were curious. The security officer let her go. Dakota walked to his table and sat down across from him. She did not speak. She just sat there and looked at the cubs. She was adding her presence to the moment. She was saying with her body that this was safe, that a human could sit with cubs and nothing bad would happen. More people began to relax. Conversations started up again in the cafeteria. People still watched, but they were no longer frozen in fear. The panic was leaving the room. Something else was replacing it, something like hope. One of the cubs climbed off the table. It moved toward Dakota. She did not pull away. The cub sniffed at her, its nostrils flaring. Then it touched her face with one small clawed hand. Dakota smiled. The cub made a sound again, that high, quick laugh. It was happy. Then a tall stepped into the cafeteria from the handler's entrance. This was not a handler. This was an adult, high-ranking, with dark markings on her scales that showed status. It was Commander Vex, the ambassador of the delegation. She had been in meetings in another part of the station, but she had been called when the cubs escaped. Commander Vex looked at her cubs on his table. She looked at the human feeding them fruit. She looked at Dakota sitting across from him. She looked at all the other species in the cafeteria, still watching. Commander Vex did not rush forward with anger. She did not call for weapons. She walked slowly towards table. Her pace was measured and calm. When she reached the table, she stopped and looked down at. Looked up at her. He did not stand. He did not bow. He just met her eyes and held her gaze. He was showing respect without showing fear. He was showing that he understood the cubs were her responsibility, but that he had no ill intent. Commander Vex spoke in her own language first, a clicking and hissing sound that was beautiful and strange. Then the translator that hung on her neck converted her words into human speech. "Why do you touch our young?" Commander Vex asked. Her voice was not angry, it was curious, it was questioning. Answered without hesitation. Because they were lost and confused, because they were curious and brave, because touching them with kindness was the right thing to do. Commander Vex was quiet for a moment. She was thinking about his answer. Then she spoke again. "Humans have killed young before," the commander said. "Why should I believe you are different?" Thought about this question carefully before he answered. He wanted to give her the truth, not just something that sounded good. "The humans who killed your young were afraid," said. "Fear makes beings do terrible things, but I am not afraid of your cubs, and I do not think you are afraid of me, not really. I think you are afraid of what might happen if we try to understand each other." Dakota was listening to this conversation. She had never heard a human speak to a like this before. Most humans were trained to use distance and formal language, was using honesty. He was using his own experience and his belief that being truthful was stronger than following protocol. One of the cubs climbed off the table again. This time it moved toward Commander Vex. The ambassador looked at the small creature walking toward her, then she looked back at. "Come," Commander Vex said. "Tell me more about why you believe this." Stood up from his seat. He moved slowly around the table and stood next to the commander. Together, they watched the cubs play on and around the table. Together, they watched Dakota laugh as one cub tried to climb onto her lap. A diplomat approached the table from the other side of the cafeteria. His name was Ambassador. He had been skeptical of humans for a long time. He believed that humans were too unpredictable, too violent, too driven by emotion instead of logic. He had attended many meetings with human representatives, and each meeting had reinforced his belief that humans could not be trusted. But he had been watching what did with the cubs. He had seen the calmness and the gentleness. He had seen that the cubs responded with joy instead of aggression. He decided that he needed to see this for himself. Ambassador walked to his table. His body language was formal and careful. He asked in his own way if he could sit with them. Nodded and gestured to an empty seat. Ambassador sat down across from Dakota. One of the cubs immediately became interested in him. The skin was a pale blue color, very different from skin and from the cub's scales. The cub reached out and touched his arm, fascinated by the different texture. Instead of pulling away, Ambassador reached back and gently stroked the cub's head. He was not trained in this. He had no manual that told him how to do this. But he was learning. He was learning that gentleness was the right choice in this moment. Other people in the cafeteria began to stand up. They began to move closer to the table. They began to understand that this moment was showing them something important. This moment was showing them that fear was not the only way to deal with beings who were different. Commander Vex watched all of this happen. She watched her cubs interact with humans and in other species. She watched them play without any sign of the violence that the training manuals talked about. She watched them be happy. She watched them be safe. When the cubs finally began to grow tired, Commander Vex made a decision. She announced it to all the people watching. "The young will stay with the human," she said. "They will spend the rest of the day learning about your kind, and we will learn about you. This is what the future will look like, or we will have no future at all." The cafeteria was quiet for a moment. Then people began to nod. People began to smile. What had started by the time evening came, the cafeteria had changed completely. More people had gathered around its table. There were humans and several other species. The cubs were in the center of a growing circle of beings from across the galaxy, and instead of fear, there was joy. Dakota had not left her seat. She had spent the entire afternoon teaching the cubs simple games using items from the cafeteria. She had shown them how to stack cups in towers. The cubs had knocked the towers down and laughed. She had drawn pictures on napkins with a pen. The cubs had tried to eat the pen and had made themselves look silly. Sat watching this unfold. He was thinking about his own military training. He had learned combat tactics and defensive strategies. He had learned how to read an enemy and predict their moves. But he had also taken classes in behavioral science and cross-species psychology during his officer training. Most soldiers had not taken these classes. They were not required, had chosen them because he believed they were important. Now, in this moment, he understood why they were important. Understanding could prevent more death than any weapon ever could. Commander Vex approached his table again. She was carrying a small device that looked like a translator but more sophisticated. She sat down next to and activated the device. When she spoke, her words came through clear and precise. "I need to tell you something," Commander Vex said. "Something that my people have been taught about humans, something that is not true but that we believed." Nodded and listened. Commander Vex explained that in all the training about cross-species relations, humans were described as dangerous and unpredictable. Handlers were trained to respond to human presence with caution and distance. They were trained to assume that humans would act with violence first and thought second. This training had come from previous incidents. Incidents where cubs had been killed by humans. Incidents where humans had been killed by. But I understand now, Commander Vex said. The incidents that happened before did not happen because young are violent. They happened because humans were afraid. And when humans are afraid, they protect themselves. They protect each other. This is not violence for its own sake. This is instinct to survive. Dakota had been listening to this conversation. She was learning the history of the misunderstanding between their species. She felt sadness hearing it. Both humans and had been hurt because of fear and poor communication. What would have happened if humans had understood this? Dakota asked. What would have happened if we had known that you were afraid too? Commander Vex was quiet for a moment, then she answered. Different choices would have been made, she said. Better choices, but we did not understand, we did not talk, we only feared. Asked a question that had been forming in his mind. Why are the handlers still prepared for combat? Asked. Why do they approach your young ones with weapons and ready for violence? Commander Vex was quiet again. This time it took longer for her to answer. Because I trained them that way, she finally said. I was given orders from the council to assume danger when humans are present. I was told that humans could not be trusted. I was told that the only safe way to manage the young and mixed species environments was to be ready for the worst. And so my handlers have feared humans, and that fear has been passed on to the young through the handlers' behavior. The cubs learned to be afraid of humans before they ever saw a human. Dakota shook her head slowly. That is the problem, she said. Fear creates fear, it grows and multiplies, and nobody stops to think that maybe there is another way. One of the cubs had climbed down from the table. It had wandered over to a section of the cafeteria where other humans sat. A young human soldier, barely more than a boy, was sitting alone at a table. The cub approached him carefully. The soldier froze. His instinct was to reach for a weapon, but he looked around the cafeteria. He saw in Dakota and Commander Vex and all the others. He saw the peaceful interaction that was happening. He saw that the cub was not attacking. It was just curious. The soldier slowly reached into his pocket. He did not pull out a weapon. He pulled out a piece of protein bar that he had been saving. He broke off a small piece and offered it to the cub. The cub took the piece and ate it. The soldier smiled. It was a real smile, not a forced one. For the first time, he understood what had been trying to show everyone. Fear was a choice, kindness was a choice, and kindness was stronger. As the evening wore on, more and more people approached the table. They wanted to talk to Commander Vex. They wanted to understand what had happened. They wanted to know if this moment meant that the tensions between humans and could be eased. They wanted to know if it was possible for their species to be partners instead of enemies. Commander Vex told them all the same thing. The young have shown us what is possible, she said. They have no fear because they have not been trained to fear. They have no prejudice because they have not been taught to prejudice. They see only other living beings to learn from and play with. If we could all be like them, even a little bit, we would have a different galaxy. Was thinking about this statement. He was thinking about how one moment of choosing kindness had created a cascade of understanding. One moment where he decided to feed a curious cub instead of running or fighting. That one moment had changed the trajectory of the entire station. By the time the cubs had grown tired and fallen asleep, curled up on cushions that people had brought from different areas of the station, the cafeteria looked like something that had never existed before. It looked like peace. It looked like cooperation. It looked like beings from different worlds and different species choosing to exist together without fear. Dakota was sitting next to one sleeping cub. She was watching its small chest rise and fall as it breathed. She was thinking about what would happen next. Would this moment last? Would this understanding hold? Or would fear come back as it always did? Seemed to read her thoughts. He leaned over and spoke quietly. Fear always wants to come back, said. But now there are people who know what is possible without fear. Now there are people who have felt what kindness feels like. That is harder to forget than any training. That is harder to ignore than any protocol. Commander Vex overheard this conversation. She stood and looked at all the beings in the cafeteria, human and alien alike, sitting together in the presence of sleeping cubs. She made a decision that would echo across the galaxy in the days and weeks to come. The next morning, news of what had happened in the cafeteria had spread across the entire station. It had also spread to other stations and outposts connected to the network. People were talking about it. Some people were excited. Others were skeptical. A few people were angry that protocol had been broken. But the cubs were still on the station, and they were still playing with humans and other species. This was the most important fact. The cubs were proof. They were living proof that fear was not necessary. Woke early in the morning in his quarters. He had not slept much. He was thinking about all the things that could go wrong now. He was thinking about military advisors who would be concerned about security. He was thinking about politicians who would want to control this moment and use it for their own purposes. He was thinking about fear that would try to rebuild itself. But he did not let these thoughts defeat him. He dressed and went back to the cafeteria. What he found there amazed him. The cafeteria was already full of people. More handlers had arrived during the night, but instead of coming to retrieve the cubs, they had stayed to observe. They were watching their young play and interact with other species. They were learning what Commander Vex had learned. They were discovering that the cubs were safe, and that safety could exist without constant vigilance and weapons. Dakota was there too. She had volunteered to help the cubs during their stay on the station. She had brought drawing supplies and toys from different areas of the station. One of the cubs was teaching itself how to draw on paper using a crayon that Dakota had given it. The drawing was not good, but the cub was trying. The cub was learning. The cub was curious about this new activity. Other human crew members had joined them as well. A pilot named sat at a table playing a simple card game with a diplomat and one of the cubs. The cub did not understand the rules of the game, but it enjoyed looking at the colors and patterns on the cards. It seemed happy just to be included. An engineer named Skitter had brought one of the cubs to the observation window that looked out onto space. The cub was fascinated by the stars. It pressed its face against the window and made sounds of wonder. It was making sounds too, communicating in its own way about the beauty of what they were seeing together. Found a place to sit and watched all of this happen. He saw beings from 5 different species doing something that had seemed impossible just one day ago. They were cooperating. They were teaching each other. They were not afraid. By midday, more humans had come to the cafeteria. Word had spread through the station about what was happening. People wanted to be part of this moment. They wanted to see the cubs. They wanted to understand what it understood. A security commander named Robert Hayes approached. Hayes was traditionally trained. He believed in protocols and careful distance from alien species. He had been skeptical about the cafeteria incident, but he had come to observe. "This is not safe," Hayes said to. "We are breaking every protocol. We are exposing our people to unpredictable danger." Turned and faced Hayes directly. "Is it dangerous?" asked. "Look around. Do you see danger? Or do you see 3 young beings who are curious about the universe and other beings in it?" Hayes looked around the cafeteria. He watched one of the cubs gently take a piece of food from a human child's hand. He watched the human child laugh. He watched the cub react to that laugh with sounds of its own that seemed like laughter. "I was trained to see danger," Hayes said. "I was trained to assume the worst, but I am having trouble seeing danger here." "That is because danger is not what is happening," said. "Understanding is what is happening. Connection is what is happening. Maybe for the first time in both our species' history, we are choosing to understand instead of choosing to fear." Hayes was quiet. He was processing what he was hearing and what he was seeing. "The Galactic Council will investigate," Hayes said. "They will want to understand why protocol was broken. They may want punishment." "I am aware," said. "But what is the alternative? Should I have run from the cubs? Should I have called for guards to remove them? Should I have chosen fear and violence over curiosity and kindness? What would that have accomplished?" Hayes did not answer. He just nodded and walked away to observe more. As the day went on, more species representatives began to interact with the cubs. A handler brought one of the cubs to sit with and Dakota. A scientist spent an hour watching the cubs solve simple puzzles. A human medical officer checked the cubs to make sure they were healthy and safe. Everyone who spent time with the cubs learned something important. The cubs did not distinguish between species when they played. They did not judge. They did not assume threat. They just played and explored and learned. And every being who played with them experienced something that had been missing from the station. Joy. By evening, there was a gathering in the cafeteria that looked like nothing the station had ever seen before. There were humans and sitting together. And playing games together. There were individuals from a dozen different species all occupying the same space without fear or suspicion. The cubs were at the center of it all, moving from group to group, bringing attention and affection and simple happiness to everyone they encountered. Commander Vex stood with and watched this scene. "The universe does not know what is happening here," the commander said. "But it will soon, and I believe it will change things." "Will the council accept this change?" asked. "Some will," Commander Vex said. "Some will resist, but the cubs will carry this memory home. The cubs will tell other young ones about their day with humans, and that story will be more powerful than any order from the council. Stories told by the young are believed by other young. Fear taught by adults can be replaced by understanding taught by friends." One of the cubs ran up to and climbed into his lap. It was tired now, as evening was approaching. It pressed its head against his chest and made a sound that resembled purring. Other cubs joined it, creating a small pile of young seeking comfort and warmth from the human who had first shown them kindness. Dakota took a picture of this moment. She knew it was important. She knew that this image would be proof of what was possible. She knew that when doubt came, when fear tried to rebuild itself, people would look at this image and remember that kindness was stronger. In the corners of the cafeteria, military advisors were talking to each other. They were concerned. They were worried about security implications. They were trying to figure out how to report this incident to their superiors. But they could not deny what they were seeing. They could not pretend that danger was happening when C-Station Commander Garrison sat in her office reviewing reports. It was 3 days after the incident in the cafeteria. She had requested a full briefing on what had occurred. She needed to understand every detail before making decisions about how to proceed. The reports were detailed and comprehensive. They described the escape of the cubs. They described decision to interact with the young creatures instead of raising an alarm. They described the subsequent peaceful interaction between multiple species. They described protocol violations and decisions that fell outside of standard procedure. Commander Garrison had been stationed on diplomatic vessels for 12 years. She had experienced many crises. She had managed conflicts between human factions and conflicts with alien species. She had learned that protocol existed for a reason. Protocol was designed to keep people safe when situations became unstable. But the report was also clear about the results. Trade negotiations between humans had accelerated dramatically. Security protocols that had been deadlocked for months were being resolved quickly. Information sharing between species that had been impossible was now possible. Fear that had characterized relations between species was being replaced with cautious optimism. One report caught Garrison's attention. It was from an ambassador named. The ambassador had written that the cafeteria incident was the most important diplomatic breakthrough he had witnessed in 30 years of service. He described how watching humans interact peacefully had changed his understanding of what was possible between species. There was a knock on Garrison's door. Lieutenant entered. He looked tired but calm. He had been expecting to be called in for questioning. "Sit," Garrison said. Sat across from the commander's desk. "I have reviewed all the reports," Garrison said. "I have statements from 97 different individuals who witnessed or participated in what happened. I have recommendations from military advisors, diplomatic representatives, and scientific observers. They all tell different stories about what occurred." Waited without speaking. He knew that Garrison needed to work through this in her own way. "The military advisors say you endangered the station by not following protocol," Garrison continued. "The diplomatic representatives say you accomplished in 3 days what months of formal negotiations could not accomplish. The scientific observers are still trying to understand what happened from a behavioral perspective." Garrison stood and walked to the window of her office. She looked out at the space surrounding the station. She was thinking. "Tell me what you were thinking," Garrison said. "When you decided to feed the cubs instead of raising an alarm, tell me what made you make that choice." Had been asked this question by many people, but this was the first time he was being asked by someone with the authority to have consequences for his answer. "I was thinking about what I had learned," said. "I was thinking about behavioral science and psychology. I was thinking about how fear creates more fear. I was thinking about the fact that the cubs were young and did not have the prejudice that adults had been taught. I was thinking about whether I could be the kind of person who helped create understanding or the kind of person who helped maintain fear. I made a choice." Garrison turned from the window and faced directly. "You broke protocol," she said. "Multiple protocols. You could have been killed. The cubs could have been killed. The entire situation could have descended into violence." "Yes," said, "all of that is true, but it did not happen that way." "No," Garrison agreed. It did not. Instead, what happened was something that will probably change the course of history for our people and the people. I wanted you to know that I am not going to punish you for what you did. But I also want you to understand that what you did cannot become a pattern of ignoring protocol. Nodded, he understood. However, Garrison continued, I am going to make a note in your record that you demonstrated exceptional judgment in a difficult situation. I am going to recommend you for promotion. And I am going to include in my official report to the Galactic Council that the cafeteria incident occurred due to an equipment malfunction that allowed the Cubs to escape, and that Lieutenant's quick thinking and compassionate response prevented a potential crisis from becoming an actual tragedy. Garrison sat back in her chair. The report will also state, she said, that this incident has led to unexpected diplomatic progress and that I am recommending that the Galactic Council consider revising protocols regarding cross-species interactions involving young individuals. After left her office, Commander Garrison recorded a personal log entry. These entries were private. They were for her own reflection and would not be shared unless she chose to share them. Today I learned something that my military training never taught me, she said to the recording device. I learned that humanity's greatest strength might not be our weapons or our technology. It might not be our ability to calculate strategies or plan for conflicts. It might be our capacity to see the goodness in others even when we have been trained to see only danger. It might be our ability to choose kindness when protocol demands caution. Lieutenant showed me today what is possible when one person decides that fear should not make the decisions. Over the next week, the station changed. More human crew members began volunteering for interspecies cultural exchanges. More representatives agreed to participate in joint projects with human teams. The barrier that had existed between their species began to dissolve. The Cubs eventually had to leave the station. Their time with the humans and other species was limited by diplomatic schedules and council decisions. But before they left, Dakota helped them create drawings for every being who had shown them kindness. She helped them create a gift that contained images of their time on the station, their time playing and learning and being safe. The Cubs carried these drawings back to the home worlds. They showed them to other young ones. They told stories about humans who were kind. They told stories about beings from other worlds who had played with them and taught them things. They told stories about how different could mean interesting instead of dangerous. Months later, a message came to the station from the council. The council had reviewed the incidents that had occurred during the Cubs' visit. The council had listened to testimony from the Cubs themselves. The council had made a decision. Relations between humans and would be formally established as a cultural and economic partnership. Restrictions on interspecies interactions would be eased. Young individuals from both species would be allowed to participate in exchange programs. Understanding would be made a priority. The message also contained a personal communication from Commander Vex. She wrote to, You showed my young ones that beings from different worlds and different species could be kind to each other. You showed them that fear is a choice, not an inevitability. They carry that lesson with them wherever they go. Because you chose kindness instead of fear, the future will be different for all of us. Read this message in his quarters. He was thinking about how one moment had changed everything. One moment of deciding not to be afraid. One moment of treating young creatures with gentleness and respect. One moment had created a cascade of consequences that were still unfolding. Commander Garrison was thinking about it too. She was in the cafeteria, looking at the space where had sat with the Cubs. She was thinking about all the moments when history could have gone a different direction. She was thinking about all the moments when someone made a choice that changed everything. And in the cafeteria, life continued. Humans and sat together and ate. They talked and laughed. They were building something new. They were building understanding. The Galactic Council sent observers to the station to document what was happening. The observers watched and recorded. They saw beings from different species cooperating without fear. They saw conflicts being resolved through conversation instead of violence. They saw something that had never been documented in the history of the Council. They saw hope. Years later, scholars and historians would write about what happened on the station. They would try to understand why one moment in a cafeteria had led to such significant changes. Some would credit Commander Vex. Some would credit Dakota and the other people who chose kindness. But the true secret was simpler than any of them realized. The true secret was that fear had been the barrier all along. And when one person chose not to be afraid, When one person chose to trust the goodness of young creatures who were innocent and curious, the entire system of fear collapsed. It did not happen all at once. It took time. It took effort. It took many people making small choices to support understanding instead of fear. But it started with one moment. It started with one person sitting still with fruit in his hand and cubs climbing onto a table. And that moment changed everything. In the cafeteria, under the soft lights and surrounded by beings from across the galaxy, the descendants of the cubs would someday tell their own cubs about the day they learned that kindness was stronger than fear. And that story would continue, growing and spreading, creating a future that was different from the past. Because that is what humans do. That is the true HFY, not dominance through force but connection through compassion, not conquest through weapons but understanding through kindness, not making yourself the strongest in the room but making yourself the most trusted. That is what makes humanity exceptional. That is what makes the difference. Was happening instead. They could not maintain their fear in the face of such clear evidence that fear was not necessary. As the night fell on the station, the cafeteria transformed into something that resembled a small community. It resembled what communities might look like in the future if beings from different species could learn to trust each other. It resembled hope. When the young wake, she said, they will show others what is possible. They will carry this understanding back to the worlds. They will tell every cub about the day they were treated with kindness by humans. That kindness will be stronger than any fear. That kindness will be the foundation of something new. A moment of frozen fear was becoming something else. It was becoming a moment of hope. Was telling the handler without words that everything was fine, that the cubs were safe, that he was safe, that this was not what fear told them it would be. The handlers stood frozen, unsure of their next move, and sat with 3 young cubs on his table, feeding them pieces of fruit, showing everyone in the cafeteria what was possible when fear did not make the choices.